This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Hey, Jason, just wanted to send you a quick message of gratitude. I'm so grateful that I got into the game and got in with properties that make sense because the rent income keeps coming in. So thank you. Glad we connected, and I'm glad to be in the income property game instead of the Wall Street game for my future.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to episode 2171, and greetings from my moving home here on the cruise ship in the Caribbean. Yes, it has been an interesting cruise. I'm learning so much every meal, just exchanging so many great ideas with so many interesting people. And last night after dinner, we went to Peter Schiff's suite here on the boat and kind of partied there for a bit. His wife did some singing for us, and we had some music and some fun and some conversations and all of that kind of stuff. So that was a good time. And, you know, Peter was on the show many, many years ago. Probably need to get him back on the show. He is the Perma Bear, as Robert Kiyosaki introduced him once on his show. He said, Peter has predicted 19 out of the last 2 recessions, but he definitely has a lot to say, and he makes some very, very interesting points. And one of our listeners kind of said it well, and he might be listening, so you'll hear me say this, but he said, it seems like with some people predicting the outcome of various things in life, in the economy, whatever, everything they say can make complete sense. But there is a difference between what should happen and what actually does happen in real life, right? It's kind of like the difference maybe between the textbook and the real practice of something. Maybe that's a comparison for it. But today, our guest, we are going to be doing this in, I think, 4 parts, because these are some pretty long discussions. And we'll do 2 of them, one today and one on the Monday show for this segment. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll do kind of part 2, some other episodes I recorded with him. We are going to talk about these things that used to be called conspiracy theories, but now they probably should be called conspiracy facts. So we'll learn a lot about some stuff that we have covered over the years, but kind of bring it back with an update on what some of the elites are doing to really impinge upon our freedoms and our rights and our ability to use money and engage in the economy, which is a huge form of freedom, most certainly. So we're going to learn about that. But on balance, I wanted to say, and by the way, our guest on this is Ivor Cummins. So we'll be here with him in just a moment. But on balance, I just wanted to point this out. Look, folks, this stuff that we discuss should not be a surprise to anybody. It is the story of history. When has there ever been a time in history where those in power are not oppressing or taking advantage of those who are not in power? That's the story of human history. It's always been that way. It's that way on a personal level. It's that way on a governmental level. It's that way on a societal level. It's that way on economic levels. Of course, all of these things. So really, nothing should come as any surprise here. This isn't some far out, wacky stuff. It's just the history of the world. This is the way things work. They've always worked this way, and they work this way now. We should not be surprised at really any of this stuff. But you are going to learn a lot of interesting nuances here. I sure did. I shared the stage with this guy a couple of weeks ago in Orlando, and I wanted to bring him on the show because we were both speakers. And it was just a really interesting talk. So we're going to have that for you in just a couple moments. But first, one of the things I love about the single family home investing world versus the commercial property investing world or the multifamily investing world is that when you enter the market and you acquire the properties, you can acquire them from investors. That's certainly the seller sometime. It's a business person, an investor. And you can also acquire the properties from traditional home owners that are owner occupants. So you have two ways to acquire, and that can be meaningful. And when you are in the disposition mode, when you are getting rid of these properties someday, when you're selling them, you can sell them to an investor, or you can sell them to a traditional owner-occupant homeowner. And these things on the entry and the exit can give you some really, really big advantages that you don't get in the commercial property world, because there you're always buying from an investor and selling to an investor. And you don't get the benefit of a more emotional counterparty, which can really benefit you. But suffice it to say that most people would probably consider the investors to be the smart money in the marketplace. And they are entering, well, not entering, but they are in the marketplace in a big, big way in the single family market. So this article, if you're looking at the screen and seeing me on video here in my cabin in my moving cruise ship home here in the Caribbean, I'm sharing my screen with you, and it says investors bought 26% of the country's most affordable homes in the fourth quarter of last year, the highest share on record. So, folks, the smart money is buying. That is my point. And look at this. When you look at the different price tiers, of course, there are so many layers to peel back of the onion always when you're looking at the marketplace. One layer, of course, is geography. You know, all real estate is local. We've talked about that many times. But also the price segments in the market. In the entry-level housing, you can see that the investors are in there with a vengeance. They want to buy these entry-level houses. And why is that? Well, look at what it says here. It's kind of counterintuitive. You've got to read between the lines in some of these headlines. So this is a report from Redfin. It says elevated home prices and mortgage rates, along with sluggish rents, have made low-priced homes increasingly attractive to investors. Investors bought 18% of all homes in the market. So this is 1/5 of the market, basically, is the investor market. And that's in the fourth quarter. But they bought 26%, as you see on the chart, of all the low-price tier homes. So hugely interested in these homes with the better rent-to-value ratios. And here you see the national investor market share at 18% overall, down slightly from, right before really, it went on for a bit after the interest rate hikes. Now we're even wondering if we'll see any Fed pivot this year at all. Come on, Jerome Powell, give us a break here, man. But you see that this overall investor share, if you just look at the trend line, is just going up and up and up and up. I mean, there was a little blip when it was higher, but it's still extraordinarily high. And in the entry-level home market, it is the highest ever on record. This chart goes back 24 years, a quarter of a century. And of course, the housing shortage is well documented. No matter what the crash bros say, they're absolutely out of their mind. Here's that chart again. Fannie Mae, the biggest mortgage player on planet Earth, the biggest mortgage player the human race has ever known, says we have a deficit of 4.4 million homes. Zillow, 4.3 million. Bank of America, we need 4 million more homes. Freddie Mac says we need 3.8 million more homes. National Association of Realtors says we need 3 million more homes. Realtor.com says we need 2.3 million homes. Morgan Stanley says we need 2 million additional homes. John Burns says 1.7 million homes. And by the way, JP Morgan, 2 million homes deficit. Moody's, 1.7 million home shortage. And Zonda, 1 million home shortage. So look, we've gone over this. We know the shortage is real. It doesn't matter what the perma bears and the crash bros say. There's no question. There is a housing shortage, and it's even more acute in the entry-level homes. So without further ado on that, let's get to our guest today, Ivor Cummins, as we talk about elite oppression. Here we go. It is my pleasure to introduce Ivor Cummins. He is the author of Eat Rich, Live Long, and that led him down the path of a bigger mission. He was in the corporate world as a complex problem solver. He is a biochemical engineer, and his interest in food and how the food supply has been corrupted led him down the path to really study the elite class and their rather diabolical plans for all of us. I shared the stage with him recently at a conference. I was a speaker on Saturday, and then he spoke on Sunday, and I was just fascinated by his topic, his depth of research, his slides, and so forth. And so we're going to be sharing those visuals. If you're listening on audio only, Ivor will explain to whatever extent possible what he's showing on the screen, but do catch this on our YouTube channel as long as it lasts up there with the powers that be. And you're really going to learn a lot. We are going to do a second interview with him later. Today, we're going to focus on the history because it's just so important that we all see the way this all evolved and became just interwoven in the entire world and is an attempt to exert so much control over the human race. And then in part two that we'll do later, we're going to explore more details and some action steps as to what we can do about it. But today, let's kind of focus on the history. Ivor, welcome. It's good to see you. And you're coming to us from Dublin, Ireland, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to be here, Jason, and great to meet in Orlando.
It's great to have you. And go ahead and just kind of tee this up for us, and let's take a deep dive in. I'm going to try to not interrupt you too much because I think you've just got so much information here. I want you to get as much out to our audience as possible.
Yeah, great. Well, like you mentioned, I mean, I'm a corporate problem-solving guy. I manage very large teams of engineers and other managers worldwide in very complex multi-factor problems. And we hear that, oh, you're not a virologist, you're not a endocrinologist, or all this nonsense. But the problem is we found out over many decades solving problems that the specialized fields can become totally blinkered. And you need a high level, what we call an integrator, to see the full breadth of what's going on and to get into depth in any specific field as required and use the specialists. But you'll never solve a complex problem with specialists. You must have an integrator. So it's kind of funny with the whole world of medicine and health. I spent 10 years getting the messages out and how that really worked, and nutrition, what real nutrition is. And no surprises, it's not what they tell us, because industry has taken over the world of nutrition. And of course, the pharmacology and the big pharma, they've taken over all the training of doctors. So unfortunately, everything we see is highly biased. So I was in that world for 10 years. Then 2020, COVID came along, and it took me a day or two to look up the Diamond Princess cruise ship and actually do a quick mathematical analysis of the impact. And it was like a severe flu, which would affect very elderly people overwhelmingly who had comorbidities. But I was able to tell my wife in March 2020, we don't need masks. We don't need to do a single thing about this. And she said, are you sure? And I said, I am 100% sure. And I also said, my 80-year-old mother who lives just down the road, she will have essentially no impact beyond the flu from this, because I knew her blood results, and I'm pretty experienced with blood test results. And I knew her health level and her vitamin D level and her insulin sensitivity without getting into detail. I knew she would not be touched by COVID. And 4 years later, that's proved true also. So I really got into COVID. And then within a couple of months, I began to realize there was something much bigger than the normal corporate corruption that was driving COVID. It was much bigger than swine flu, which was mostly big pharma kind of profiteering. And I began to learn about the World Economic Forum, and I realized, oh no, this is a half-century long kind of plan that's now breaking on our shores. So that's what I spent the time on, to understand the geopolitical history. And if you understand the history, you are inoculated forever from all the nonsense and propaganda they can throw at you. If you understand the history, you are tungsten carbide.
Yeah, I love the meme. Sometimes these little memes that are going around contain so much truth in such a small message. One that's going around is, whenever I'm not feeling good about myself, I have to realize that over $1 trillion of propaganda didn't work on me.
Yes.
I love that one. And
Perfect.
they were able to withstand over $1 trillion of propaganda. So take us into the whole thing, and please share your screen and let's look at this, because you've got some great visuals, and do try and explain those to the people who are audio only to whatever extent possible.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. So I'm just sharing the first slide now. This is the New York Times in September 2020. And I was getting a lot of reach. I wasn't too heavily censored because I always referenced everything I said with published papers or government data. But then I got too popular and I put out a viral video. It got 2 million views in a week. And the New York Times did a hit job on me, an Irish engineer. And they spent a half a page saying how he's not correct, he's not an expert. But the funny thing was, Jason, a year or two later, when all the data was in, I checked every aspect of my video and the article that I'm showing now. And as it happened, not being smart, I was correct in every single vector, of course. But because I so effectively, with references and graphs and published data, I so effectively destroyed the viral narrative, the COVID narrative, that's why the New York Times did a half-page article on an Irish engineer. So just show you the power of the system. The phones, started buzzing, and the New York Times was told, you gotta get this guy. It doesn't matter who it is, how small he is, because CEOs of significant corporations were beginning to ask the experts, is this Irish guy right? Because he seems very convincing. So they did a hit job, and then the next day, YouTube took down around 16 of my videos, put me on a double strike. So I was chastised for telling the truth.
Yeah.
And then I knew beyond all doubt, I knew already.
Yeah.
I knew that it sadly was a, quote, conspiracy, because that simply wouldn't happen in a real world.
Yeah. And as I've said for easily 15 years right here on this show, just go listen to my old interviews, folks. Many of you have. There are conspiracies all around us all the time. Anybody who doesn't believe that is a conspiracy theorist themselves. This whole idea of making this can be considered some sort of wacky, outlandish thing. I mean, a conspiracy is just two or more people planning something in secret. Right. I mean, of course, that happens every moment of every day all around the world. Right. It's not a big deal. And I would submit to you that the United States of America was a conspiracy. Okay. That's how it started, as a conspiracy against the British crown. So, if you don't believe in conspiracy theories, you're just an idiot. I'm sorry. I mean, of course, there are conspiracy theories and conspiracy facts. Well, let's just put that on the table to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And conspire just means to breathe together.
Yeah.
And it just means people get together relatively secretly, but not necessarily secretly.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys publish everything, like the Rockefeller Archives and WEF. They're even smarter. They publish everything theoretically, but no media covers it. So they make sure they're not too secret, because they know it's not going to be covered, so they can actually say it and go on the record and still do it.
One of the other things, so that's their out to say, look, this is not a secret. We publish this. You can just look on our website. I mean, a lot of this stuff is right there out in the open. But again, the media doesn't pick it up. So it's there. They can use it to defend. But again, it's not published widely. And the other part of it is that, like anybody, it's just part of human nature. If there's a group that is doing something and they consider what they're doing to be an accomplishment, right, which that's what they get up and do every day, they want to show their accomplishments off. They want to brag about them. So they drop in little hints here and there, symbolism, all sorts of funny things, So this stuff really isn't that much of a secret, as you said. But okay, go ahead.
Yeah, very good. So I'm just going to the next slide. I show the text of the New York Times, and I'm going to frame it. It's just so beautiful, because everything they said was nonsense, of course. And that video with all the facts was correct. But it did bring me on to the World Economic Forum, which is a very important organization. And some people think, oh, it's a talk shop in Davos, and they go in private jets and they bring in presidents and leaders, but they're just talking. But that's not true. That's naive. The World Economic Forum, I'll briefly mention where it came from. It came from the loins of Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and they clearly set out they wanted a world government. dominated by the West, and they worked with the State Department, and even the CIA were funding their conferences. So this is not small time. This is the richest family in America, in bed with the State Department and basically planning American dominance and in a world government. The opposite of a conspiracy theory. And you could even say, to our earlier point, it wasn't really hidden, as I'll show you. They kind of documented everything, but they always use kind of fancy language about saving granny and improving the state of the world. And that language covers them. They kind of say what they're going to do, but they put it in language that makes it sound good, which is the oldest trick in the book. And I'm going to skip that joke there and go to Benito Mussolini. I'm a World War II buff. I've watched thousands of hours of documentaries. I'm just into it. But Mussolini, I knew for many, many years. He defined fascism properly, and it's very important to know the definition. It should be rightly called corporatism, as it is a merger of corporate and government power. That is the definition of fascism. So we're all told, oh, you're against immigration, you're a fascist. Nonsense. Oh, you know, you're against masking, you're a fascist. Completely absurd. Fascism is the merger of government and corporate power. And that's what National Socialism was in Germany with that nasty man, Adolf, and all the other regimes. They joined the means of production and the corporate and the wealthy with the government, and they made a totalitarian system. Once you understand that, you realize they're selling us fascism. You know, it's important. And Mussolini also said, for the fascist, everything is the state. Now, is the state or is the corporate power, is the WEF? It doesn't matter. Everything is the collective power broker. And nothing human or spiritual exists, much less as value, outside the state. In this sense, fascism is totalitarian. And that's another key thing. Communism, fascism, they're all just forms of totalitarianism.
Right.
It's where the state or the corporate or the elite run the system and the people are ants in an ant farm.
Yep.
They're all the same. Communism, fascism, they debate. Oh, the new regimes in the world today, they're like communism, socialism. Oh, they're like fascism. It's all BS. Communism, fascism, as Ayn Rand said, they're basically just thugs fighting over the same turf.
Exactly.
It's all totalitarianism.
You know, it's very interesting. I'm glad you brought up Mussolini because I have studied him a fair bit, and I think history does not give him enough attention because what we've got now is we have these iron triangles in society that are the corporatocracy, the state, and, you know, the special interest lobbyists, right? They cannot be broken, it seems. Why would a group called Antifa exist to say that the people who want freedom, that don't want to be controlled, that don't want the big pharma companies and the state to be in bed together, how are they the fascists? They're the complete opposite, you know. But interestingly, you mentioned Ayn Rand, and I've studied Ayn Rand extensively, and she's sort of hard to pin down because, interestingly, she called the libertarians the hippies of the left in a derogatory, or the hippies of the right, sorry, in a derogatory way. So it's sort of hard to pin Ayn Rand down, you know, to say she's an objectivist. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Ayn Rand, she came out with some great quotes and she largely had it correct. I wasn't actually aware of that libertarian kind of slur.
Yeah, the hippies of the right. Yeah.
The hippies of the right. I can kind of see her logic in some ways, some of them, but I think it was misplaced. And, you know, but the key thing is that Rockefeller and the Rockefellers basically were very smart. Their father was the psychopath, John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, and he indoctrinated his 5 sons in the key vision of the family. And it was not to do with making more money because they had more money than he could ever spend. It was about them taking their destiny and leading the creation of a world government, the ultimate world government. And that's what they were born and bred for. And the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in the 50s essentially set in motion everything that leads us to where we are today. And Dr. Nordengard, Jakob Nordengard in Sweden, I owe a huge debt to because I knew a lot of this. But in 2022, I discovered his lectures. He did a PhD on the Rockefellers in 2012. And the Rockefeller lawyers tried to stop it getting published. And they couldn't. The professors backed Nordengard. It was all factual. It was all referenced to the Rockefeller archives and published sources. And they failed. And he published it. And he wrote a book I'm showing on the screen now, Rockefeller Controlling the Game. And basically, that book is astonishing. And it filled in all the gaps I had. All the climate change nonsense, the COVID, the pharma stuff, the geopolitics. That book basically explains not just that the Rockefellers controlled the whole game for the last 70 years, but they needed massive amounts of allies. They needed allies in Harvard, the State Department, CIA, huge amounts of organizations, UN, WHO, which they helped set up. They donated the buildings in 1946 and the money. And the Club of Rome, climate catastrophe propaganda group of rich guys, Bilderberg, they're all the same guys. And they're all going for a world government, which, needless to say, Jason, they talk in lovely terms about 15-minute cities and sustainability, but it's all BS. What it is a perfect, as my daughter said in 2020, they want an ant farm, don't they? And I said, that's exactly it. They want a nice managed ant farm in the West. China already has pretty much a nice managed ant farm, and they want to be able to deal like with China, ant farm to ant farm, ant leaders to ant leaders.
Let me just elaborate on what you're saying a moment. Starting about maybe 15 years ago on this show, we did some episodes about UN Agenda 21. And everybody needs to understand that under the guise of the environment, right? Look, green trees have red roots, as they say, right? In communism, in other words. And under the guise of the environment, the kind of control and the kind of con they can persuade us all into is amazing. Of course, we're all in favor of a good environment, right? Nobody wants a bad environment, except maybe the warmongers who are destroying the environment with their wars. That's you, Joe Biden, by the way. But 15-minute cities, UN Agenda 21, right? If you corral most of the population into small spaces and make them dependent on the system rather than being on the farm in rural areas, growing their own food, self-sustained, they are dependent on the system, and then the elites have control of them. It's a much easier way for them to gain control over people, is to corral them.
It's the perfect way. And actually, that's why I always acknowledge the opponents are smart. I don't think they'll win ultimately, and we can talk in the next chat about the pushback. But at the end of the day, it's a smart strategy, and I'm not surprised they picked it. Give people hobgoblins, made up fears of climate disaster and population explosion, give them plenty of fear, and then say, we can save you from these hobgoblins. We can save you from this fear. Problem, reaction, solution. And Rockefeller, it's funny, in the 50s, they identified climate disaster, pandemics, and global financial crashes. What was the other one? I think macro terrorism. They actually pre-identified the opportunities, the narratives that would help them convince the people to go with their new world government. But they identified those, including pandemics and climate crisis, with no scientists in the room. So I think it's important to understand, or people to understand, if something like climate crisis and pandemic nonsense is identified by ultra-rich sociopaths with no scientist presence, and then they fund scientists for the next half century to go along with those stories, what's the chances that those stories are actually real scientifically? And the answer, Jason, is zero, right? You know that. It's common sense.
Right. And let me mention something else that's complete common sense. I mean, folks, this is so basic and so obvious. Everybody listening or watching knows that you can buy off a politician. That's what the whole field of being a lobbyist is all about. It's about trading favors and crony capitalism and money in brown paper bags, or, here's some land I'm developing, or, hey, Nancy Pelosi, I'm a CEO of this public company, and maybe you should buy some stock right now because we're about to do something that nobody knows about. I mean, it's endless, the amount of favoritism and cronyism that goes on. Well, if you can buy off a politician, and everybody knows you can, everybody knows politicians are all sponsored, just like Formula One cars in a race. Okay, it's just no different. Why would you think that you can't buy off a scientist or entire scientific companies or communities or associations? Of course you can. Who sponsors the conferences? Who pays for the golf tournaments? This is done with pharma. I mean, there's so much evidence of this. It's just ridiculous amount of influence peddling.
Yeah, at this stage, it's a parody of itself. I mean, the scientists that came out promoting seed oils, which we know are factory kind of concocted chemical compounds, which are terrible for health. They're inflammatory. But they bought the science on that, so we all eat our heart-healthy seed oils or vegetable oils. And they told us that meat, fish, and eggs, which we evolved on, we literally, Homo sapiens, came from that. They've told us for 40 or 50 years, they're bad for us. So like you say, Jason, it's comical. It's so easy to buy the scientists. And recently I came across an example that...
And they told us fat was bad. and sugar and fake sugar, even worse, is good.
Of course.
It's
insane. This is how they work. And you know,
all you have to do to know this is true is just, if you're old enough, just remember what people used to look like in the 70s and 80s and look at them today. Everybody's overweight. Everybody's unhealthy. It's insane. They have poisoned the United States for sure, and most of the world as well. It's just pathetic what these people have done.
Yeah, and almost gleefully. I mean, they literally have zero conscience. They don't.
Hey, why would you? You have the diabetes industrial complex, the cancer industrial complex, the vaccine industrial complex. I mean, the mental health and SSRI industrial complex. There's so much money to be made here.
It's a feeding frenzy. And at this stage, the only reason people aren't utterly rebelling like they did against John D. Rockefeller in the 1900s, the only reason is these guys were smart enough to pretty much buy up the media. So the media feed a pipeline of utter propaganda 24/7 to the people. And we all saw it during COVID. It became comical. Round the clock talk about basically a bad flu rebranded as the bubonic plague. And a lot of people said, hold on a minute, I don't know anyone who died. And I don't really know anyone who was very sick. But the television is telling me every day that this is Armageddon. So a lot of people said, hold on a minute. But after a couple of months of round-the-clock propaganda, most humans actually reset their frame of reference. It's a psychological trick that humans do. If they're out of step with their tribe, even if they're convinced the tribe is wrong, if all the experts keep saying X, after a while it becomes very uncomfortable, and they psychologically just say, well, okay, I accept X. And then they just roll. And that's what happened in COVID. It's old psychology.
Yeah, it isn't amazing to everybody. Try and remember the end of COVID, right? Try and remember when that happened, right? I remember about when it happened. And I remember that I had Peter Zion on the show. He's been on many times. He's the geopolitical guy. He's written lots of interesting books. At the start of our last interview, he said, well, when everyone decided COVID was over, that's what he said. Like, it was just a decision people made. Yeah. They wanted to move on with their lives. And funny thing, that was pretty much true.
Yeah. I mean, people were sick of it. Someone up the top decided, okay, people are beginning to really get sick of COVID. They're beginning to really question the whole bloody thing. We'd better quit while we're ahead. But then, of course, immediately they slotted in Ukraine. And then we had a year of propaganda on Ukraine. And basically, even though in 2014 there was the CIA-connected coup, they got rid of the elected Russian-favoring president, and they brought in the scumbag Zelensky. I mean, even though that was all technically on the record, everyone forgot it. And they all, Mr. Putin bad, Orange Man bad. I mean, this is the problem. With the ownership of the media, you can brainwash otherwise smart people to strenuously believe any nonsense. It is quite scary what they can do with their media ownership.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.